Imagine living in an isolated, far northern community. You're surrounded by wilderness, and often in the winter, the entire area is blanketed by ice and snow. There are no major roads in or out of town, and often to go shopping or to get medical supplies, you have to take a 14-hour journey by train. This isn't some wild made-up scenario though. This is the way of life in Schefferville, Quebec, an old mining town of only 213 people. At first glance, it seems to just be like any other small town in remote northeastern Canada. However, the sense of normality fades once you notice the train station. Canada is a country by no means known for rail travel, but the train station in Schefferville is the lifeline for the community here. But once the mines dried up, the train stopped servicing Schefferville, leaving its mostly indigenous inhabitants isolated. Schefferville is part of an area historically inhabited by indigenous peoples who have lived there for potentially thousands of years. But to understand this story, we have to zoom out and examine this stretch of land that crosses down from this part of Quebec through Labrador and back into Quebec, all the way to the small city of Sept-Îles, far away from the major cities in the more southern province. For millennia, this area has been inhabited by peoples such as the Innu and the Naskapis. Eventually, the French colonized much of this land, leading to the most commonly spoken language being French. English started to become fairly common as well. The town, now known as Schefferville, is fairly young as far as settlements go. It was established formally in 1954 by the Iron Ore Company of Canada as a way of supporting mining operations in the area. And a railway was built in the region to help carry ore supplies and passengers. This was part of the Quebec North Shore and Labrador Railway, or the QNSL for short. To help construct the railway and even work the mines, members of the Innu and Naskapi peoples were forced to resettle to the area in and around Schefferville. And as we've established, it gets cold in Schefferville. It once reached minus 50 degrees Celsius. Without proper insulation and housing, the conditions here can prove deadly. Though they were brought in to be workers, their communities faced neglect and discrimination from the local government. And within a decade, most of them were living in extremely poor conditions. Things started to change in the late 1960s. Housing units were finally built for the local indigenous peoples, and part of the area was declared a reservation. These are territories set aside by the Canadian government for First Nations people. In 1970, iron mining was hitting its peak in the area. To deal with this, more workers were brought in, and the population hit a high of around 5,000 people. But over the next decade, iron deposits began to dry up, and mining focuses shifted elsewhere. In 1982, the iron mining around Schefferville completely stopped, on orders from the president of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, Brian Mulroney, who would later be elected Prime Minister of Canada. Things quickly began to decline in Schefferville and many of the surrounding towns. Within a few years, most of the non-Indigenous residents had left. By 1986, so many people had left the town that it lost its status as an incorporated settlement. With that came a decline in the municipal services. By 1991, only 110 people remained. However, Schefferville lives on today. The town continues moving forward, slowly and more physically disconnected from the wider world. The only saving grace is the small local airport and the railway. In the 1970s, the QNSL operated multiple daily freight and passenger trains from Schefferville through Labrador and back into Quebec, terminating in Sept-Îles. Passenger and freight services would continue, subsidized in part by the Canadian government. However, even with government subsidies, the QNSL was unable to profit from passenger services. That's not to mention the logistical challenges of operating this rail line. Some stops along the line are literally at cabins or camps, and often in the winters these are covered in several feet of snow. And remember, northeastern Canada is far away from, well, nearly everything. There's no major highways and it is sparsely developed, and the railway is dotted with old bridges and tunnels. To add to this, the QNSL operates on an isolated rail network. This means that the tracks are completely separate from the main Canadian rail network. So this passenger route was unprofitable and had a ton of logistical nightmares. Here's an idea, said one of the stakeholders in the company. Let's find a way to rid ourselves of this passenger service. It didn't matter if doing so ran the risk of further isolating local communities, their bottom line was being thrown into question. As this was all happening, it was thought that perhaps Via Rail, the Canadian government-owned rail service, would take over the route. But that would never be the case, perhaps due to the tiny population or operational costs, but nobody seemed to be interested in taking over this rail service. So let's head back to Schefferville.
Jusqu'à Schefferville,
knowing that their only viable link to the rest of Canada was in jeopardy, representatives of 3 different local Indigenous band councils came together to try to take over operations in the early 2000s. And the Churiton Rail Transportation Company was formed and entered into negotiation to purchase the track that ran south from Schefferville to Emerald Junction. This is the point where the main QNSL line splits off towards Labrador City. In late 2005, both parties reached an agreement. They received the desired track along with the rights to operate passenger services on the rest of the QNSL line, and it cost them just $1 Canadian. It was more of a ceremonial handover of essential services than of a proper corporate sale, which I guess just shows how much the QNSL or the Canadian government cared about this railroad. A frequent service would resume in December of 2005, and perhaps this is just me coming from a European perspective, but calling it frequent is perhaps a little bit generous. The TRT operates a singular train that runs in each direction either once or twice a week, depending on the time of year. On most journeys, the trip will last around 14 hours, often depending on the number of stops, the weather conditions, and if there's any conflict with the QNSL freight trains, the trip takes nearly 24 hours. There is also a driver swap that occurs at Emerald Junction. After this, a QNSL engineer takes over, though it's still considered part of the TRT. Tickets are just under 175 Canadian dollars for a round trip from Sept-Îles to Schefferville, which does seem like quite a lot at first, but keep in mind this isn't a tourist railway. There's only 1 seat class, coach. There is a dining car on board, along with a microwave, if you need it, but there's no sleeping car, and a good portion of the train is dedicated to cargo. The only intent of the TRT is to transport local peoples and supplies. While there have been no major line expansion since 2005, the TRT has done some upgrades. In 2017, this new train station was opened in Schefferville. And in 2021, they were granted a $55 million Canadian grant from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and the provincial government of Quebec to modernize their operations. The TRT plans to do station upgrades and to add Wi-Fi on board the trains, because much of the region lacks phone service. You're not going to be getting 5G, 4G, or even 3G out in northeastern Canada. They also plan to acquire a new, more efficient diesel locomotive, as none of the current lines are electrified. This is all great news because the current equipment is aging, and as we've seen, the railway is vital to the community and its connection to the outside world. It's also become a major source of employment for these towns, and it's a way for groups of people who have lived in a place for generations to exercise control over their own lands. Whether as a source of pride, resource shipping, or transportation, and having to navigate the sometimes icy geography of the region it crosses through, the TRT is a truly vital asset to this part of Canada. Which brings us back to Schefferville. Small, remote, but a vital part of several communities of Indigenous peoples, who keep much of this part of Canada truly alive by operating this rather unconventional railway.